Hey everyone, it's Ben Hardy here, and in today's going to be talking about Dodge, Ram, Jeep, Chrysler, and the other brands that are under the Stellantis umbrella, because we are talking about what is happening with Stellantis. Before we get in this video though, as always, if you're going to save time and money the next time you purchase a car, link to my car buying guide in the description down below, and a lot of the information within this video comes from Cox Automotive. With that being said, let's just dive right into it. So the big headline figure is that Stellantis is up by 6% year over year with volume of sales. Now this sounds really positive on the surface, but once you dive into the industry average, it kind of changes everything, because the industry average year over year is a 17% increase. So Stellantis is still lagging behind the rest of the automotive industry. So last quarter, they sold just over 430,000 vehicles, which is significantly lower than where they were at prior to the pandemic. Now, if we dive into some of the brands that are under the Stellantis umbrella, it's kind of mixed. Ram saw a 3% increase, Jeep saw a 3% decrease, which is actually pretty positive, because last quarter Jeep's decrease year over year was like 20%. So their decrease isn't nearly as bad. And if we dive into some individual models within the Jeep lineup, the Gladiator is still doing absolutely horrible. People aren't buying them. But the Grand Cherokee, on the other hand, is actually selling quite well. It'll be interesting to see kind of what happens. And Wrangler sales actually fell as well, which is interesting. So Wrangler and Gladiator are struggling. But, you know, I mean, both of those had huge price increases, so that probably goes into that. And then when you dive into the Ram brand, 1500s are just pretty much flat with these sales. The Ram ProMaster is still selling really well. And a big part of that is there's a lot of commercial sales happening in 2023. And on top of that, it's just hard to get cargo vans right now. And then within the Dodge brand and the Chrysler brand, both of those are actually doing pretty well right now. The Chrysler Pacifica is selling quite well because, again, the minivan market's hot and there's just not a lot of inventory there. The Dodge Durango is also doing really well. The Challenger is kind of sliding, which makes sense because, you know, they're winding things down with production with that. The Charger is still actually doing strong. It's actually doing better than the Challenger right now, which is kind of interesting in terms of its percent increase year over year. And then if we dive into the last two brands, Alfa Romeo and Fiat, Fiat's basically gone. I've kind of talked about this. They just don't really sell that many cars in the US. And then Alfa Romeo sales are still down, which is pretty interesting. We'll kind of talk about that later towards the end of the video. But the next thing is going to be market share. Stellantis' market share is now at 10.56%. If you're wondering, you know, where Stellantis usually sits, they're usually in the 13% range in terms of their market share. At least that's what it was like prior to the pandemic. So they've lost quite a bit of market share here in the US over the course of the pandemic. And a large part of the market share loss has been because of the Jeep brand, you know, losing so many sales over the last year or so. Now, this is happening at the same exact time that Stellantis has some of the highest incentives in the car industry. So right now, average incentive spend is about $2,000. Stellantis is at over $3,000 for their average incentive spend across their brand. So it shows that they're spending a ton of money to sell these cars, at least compared to other automakers. But something to note is this is still below what we saw prior to the pandemic. Again, average incentive spend was in the $4,000 to $5,000 range back then. So we still aren't to pre-pandemic levels. And again, another thing to mention is, you know, prices are also a lot higher today. So it's like we have bigger incentives, but we also have much bigger prices. And so the percentage of discount we're getting off of new vehicles is not nearly as much as what it was prior to the pandemic, because lower prices, bigger incentives back then. But anyways, I digress. Something that is interesting to note is that the incentive spend is not linear across the brands. There's big incentives with the Jeep brand, for example, but, you know, much smaller incentives with like the Chrysler brand, for example. So it just depends on the product, how well it's selling, and that'll determine how much incentive is getting thrown onto the product. Now, the next thing is average transaction price. Stellantis' average transaction price across all their brands is just over $57,000. It's a 5% increase year over year, and that is above the average transaction price for a brand new car here in the US market. It's less than $50,000. Now, Stellantis does technically have a luxury brand under the umbrella, Alfa Romeo, but their volume is so low that it doesn't really affect the numbers all that much. So this shows that Stellantis, just like Ford, is asking, you know, not quite luxury car prices, because the average transaction price for a luxury car is like the high $60,000 range, but they're asking above non-luxury car prices for their non-luxury cars. They're kind of, you know, right in that in-between area, which is definitely interesting. And so with that being said, let's kind of dive into what this means for Stellantis, kind of my thoughts across all of the brands. So first off, the increase in incentive spend, I definitely think that this is helping, move some of the product for the Stellantis brands, especially with Jeep and with Ram, because, the percent increases that we saw with the prices on some of these vehicles are just astronomical. I mean, look at a Ram 1500. Prior to the pandemic, you could get a fully decked out truck in the $50,000 range, and now that's a $80,000 truck in today's market. And so, some level of discount on these vehicles with these huge price increases will definitely help. And I think that Stellantis is just kind of playing the slow game where they're basically just slowly trickling in incentives, seeing what's happening with sales. And, now that sales, with some of the brands are kind of just staying flat or slightly increasing, shows them that, they're kind of on the right track and they're not really going to do anything too crazy, because again, you have to remember, this is a company that's all about profitability. Now, some other brands, Alfa Romeo, Fiat, those brands, kind of an interesting situation. So with Fiat, again, they're pretty much out of the US market at this point. Like, there's just so few vehicles sold with that brand. I think that we'll get an announcement sometime, maybe at the end of this year, next year. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but I just am always surprised to still see that like some dealers are selling these vehicles. I'm sure we'll see more dealer franchises just get rid of the Fiat brand because they don't want to deal with it. And then when it comes to Alfa Romeo, here's the deal, at least what I've kind of noticed anecdotally, is Alfa Romeo is building a lot of cars that people don't really want, and they're not really building as many of the cars of what people want. So, for example, you've got the Quadrifoglio models, which are really popular because they've got high performance, and they just don't build all that many of them. They build a bunch of the 4-cylinder turbo cars that they're cool, but also like there's just not as much excitement behind those models. So I think that is kind of affecting them. And then I think the other part is just, frankly, the brand at this point, right? They have recently returned to the US market, and so it's going to take quite some time for them to build, larger brand recognition. And, they do have some cool things going for them, but I do also think that they maybe need to go out on a limb a little bit more to kind of build some more excitement behind their brand. Like, look at what Genesis has done, for example. And speaking of Genesis, something else that has happened over the course of the pandemic is the Hyundai Motor Group is now bigger than Stellantis. Like, they sell more cars than Stellantis. That's kind of another interesting stat to go into this whole situation. And so what I personally see moving forward with Stellantis is just the slow approach that they've been taking, where they, if they can have pricing power certain vehicles, yeah, they'll slightly increase prices. If they don't have pricing power and vehicles aren't selling, they're going to slowly trickle in incentives. And, again, they're not going to do anything massive because they want to maintain as much profitability as they can, but also, bring some of the customers back. And I ultimately think that this is going to have somewhat of an effect of what they want, where it is going to bring in more customers, but I also think that there's going to be the negative impact of, the fact that they're going to continue to lose market share to other automakers that didn't increase their prices nearly as much. And, if they did increase their prices more, are more willing to incentivize product to get it down to a more reasonable price point to regain market share, because I think the market moving forward is going to be way more about market share more than anything else. And so losing market share is going to not only hurt Stellantis, but it's also going to hurt the dealer network as well, because they're not going to have as many people servicing the product because there's not as many people purchasing the product. So it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Stellantis situation. Let me know what you think Stellantis should do to regain their lost market share and to catch up with the rest of the automotive industry. Again, they're at a 6% gain, whereas the rest of the industry is at a 17% gain. I'll see you.